Okay, so here we are back again with resource management. Part 2, we're going to talk about slippage, resource utilization, and in-process inventory. So slippage is when things begin to go into delay, right? Could be cost or schedule slippage, etc. And, if you're in a contract, it could cost you penalties. You want to really track, as a project manager, your slippage. So just be aware of that. So in-process inventory, this is the amount of work that's waiting to be processed when there's a shortage of some resource. So sometimes what I've done is when I have in-process inventory is I will break that down into a Kanban board so I can see the work that is to do, the work being done, and the work done for that narrow segment. It helps me to track it a little bit. And that's what they mean about the WIP rate, the work in process rate, right? And I can measure for that in process inventory my work in process. And I can see where there's a breakdown or a clogging up of that work in process if it's not keeping up with my established WIP, work in process. So it's just another measure for that. And there could be holding costs, right? One of the things I could add to the contract, or they may add on me if I bid for the contract, is holding costs if I'm not keeping up with the WIP. We had mentioned heuristic. Heuristic means rule of thumb, right? It's a common term that you want to get used to in the industry because every company will have various heuristics that you will work from. So multiple projects really can become very, very complex for a mathematical optimization approach. It's preferred, but let's be honest, sometimes there's just too much going on. So we want to use heuristics, right? These are best practices that have turned into common expressions that are now rules of thumb used on the project. So we also want to make priorities within our project, right? Not everything has the same level of priority. And so you want to look at your resource scheduling method. What's the minimum late finish time? Can I slip or delay an activity without slipping the whole project? Sure. If it's not on the critical path, I probably can. Which activity has the most demand for my current set of resources, right? That's going to be a priority. Which series of activities have the greatest resource utilization, etc. So there's various ways that you can prioritize your resource utilization. There are other things addressed in the book for multi-project scheduling heuristics, so you should make sure you read that as you go along. And of course, Gantt charts can be useful in the expression of these to identify linkages between the various program and project efforts throughout, right? Now, Goldratt. I'd mentioned Eliyahu Goldratt, and he wrote the book Critical Chain, which I recommended in schedule management last week. And so Goldratt's concept of critical chain was that, it is the critical path method. It's the same approach mathematically. But Goldratt thinks that people are just optimistic, so their estimates aren't going to be right. And that capacity should always equal demand. And we had talked about Parkinson's law before, which was that you will make the work fill the time period allotted. So if I give you 2 weeks and you finished in a week, you're not going to report back that it's done. You're going to wait a week. You're going to review it again. You're going to make sure it's perfect, right? Move it on. It's a project. If it's done, it's done. We talked about student syndrome, right? Where okay, nothing personal, but students tend to stay up and pull an all-nighter the night before to finish an assignment on time, right? And multitasking can also help reduce idle time. So because of that, what Goldratt did was he took the network approach and he said, okay, I'm going to cut your activity times in half. And by cutting your activity times in half, I'm going to give you half the time you thought you had, but I'm not throwing away that other time. What I'm doing is I'm moving all those little times from each activity. So if one activity was 4 days, now it's 2. If it was 6 days, now it's 3. And I'm moving those 2 and 3 days, those extra, and I'm moving it to the end of my project. And I'm going to manage that as the project manager. I will call it the buffer use rate. How much of my buffer is being used up? And I will manage that. And I think people, even though they gave me an honest estimate, still with student syndrome, still with Parkinson's law, etc., that people's optimism, I don't think they were right. I'm not saying they were cheating me. I'm saying they gave me a good estimate, but they aren't right. You really want to, it's a great book. Pick it up and read it. I think you would enjoy it. Goldrat's Critical Chain. And the next question is, so each activity has an early start and an early finish, and a late start and a late finish on each activity. We saw those in the numbers. So do early finishes and late finishes cancel each other out? And the answer is no. And this is why I end up with float on some activities, right? And again, workers tend to not admit to finishing early. That's Parkinson's syndrome. Also, remember, resources may not be available, so things don't necessarily cancel themselves out. And so this lists, and the book articulates it well, a common chain of events that you might want to consider when building your project. Now, this whole approach, whether it's critical path or critical chain, it's using the critical path type events. Critical chain just cuts the times in half. This is simplifying it, but it's good enough, and moves them to the end of the project after the end date, and you, the project manager, manages that buffer use rate. And the other piece to critical chain is that you then may have to because you've really tightened it down, the activities, you will want to consider resource utilization again if you're using Goldrat's approach, right? We said the longest path in the network, which is the shortest period of time that you can finish a project, is called the critical path or critical chain. Okay, and so here are the paths. You would have the critical path, and notice this buffer. Any buffers from these activities that you cut in half, you would add them up out here after the project and measure how much you're using of your buffer. If you have, or if you're using more buffer, say at this point in the project, than you had allotted, that's an issue, and you probably want to go back and re-estimate is what I would do. Okay, and so that's a little bit about the critical chain. Critical chain, that's the with the feeder chains. Okay, that wraps up resource management. The rest is in the literature. Notice online I give an additional gift quiz that you can read through, answer the questions, and see if you're mastering the points. Okay, I love it. You guys, see you online.